What would you do if you stumbled upon a diary hidden in the ground beneath a huge anthill, not far from an abandoned estate? Who would have thought that this time-worn journal, covered in insect trails and soaked with the dampness of the Smolensk soil, would become the key to unraveling one of the most horrific stories of post-revolutionary Russia? A story that many tried to bury along with its participants. A story that was not supposed to surface after more than a century. Welcome to a journey through the dark pages of the past, which would have been better left untouched. If you're ready to hear this story to the end, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and delve into the chilling secret of the Sokolov family, which unfolded in the Smolensk province in the years following the October Revolution. Dmitry Pakhomov always considered himself a man of science, not superstition. A candidate of historical sciences specializing in the study of Russia's transitional period from empire to the Soviet state, he spent most of his academic career delving into archives and libraries. But none of his previous expeditions could have prepared him for what he discovered in April of 2023, 20 kilometers from Smolensk, on the territory of the former Sokolov estate. The estate, once belonging to a wealthy merchant family, was converted into communal housing after the revolution, then into a collective farm warehouse, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, simply abandoned. The main house had long since collapsed, leaving only the foundation and a few walls overgrown with moss and lichen. Dmitry arrived here on the advice of his colleague, Professor Anton Vitalevich, who mentioned that documents had been found in the local archives indicating strange events at this estate in 1919. It was a cool spring day when Dmitry wandered along the overgrown paths of the former garden. The air was saturated with the scent of damp earth and decaying foliage. The buzzing of insects and the chirping of birds created a strange, almost unnatural atmosphere of life against the backdrop of obvious decline and destruction. It was then that his attention was drawn to a strange mound of earth that stood out against the relatively level surface of the garden path. It was an anthill, but an unusual one. Its shape was too regular, almost geometric, as if the ants were building their home around some artificial object. Obeying his research instinct, Dmitry carefully began to dig up the anthill, trying not to disturb the ecosystem more than necessary. Ants scurried in panic in all directions, and their aggressive brethren attacked the historian's hands, leaving painful bites. But Dmitry was too intrigued to stop. After 20 minutes, his fingers felt something hard and smooth. Clearing the object of soil and ants, he discovered a small tin box covered in rust and corrosion. The box was sealed, but the lock had long since rusted through and easily gave way when Dmitry tried to open it. Inside, wrapped in several layers of oiled cloth, lay a leather-bound diary. Opening the first page, Dmitry saw an inscription in calligraphic handwriting: Personal Diary of Elizaveta Sokolova, begun January 7, 1919. Below this inscription, in a different handwriting, more uneven and hurried, was added: If you have found this diary, know that everything written here is true. For your own good, do not look for us, Mikhail Sokolov. At that moment, Dmitry felt a strange sensation, a mixture of professional excitement at the find and inexplicable anxiety. A light wind rustled through the trees, and it seemed to him that someone was watching him from the dense thickets of the former park. But it was too late to retreat. The historian already held in his hands the key to a secret that had been waiting to be revealed for over 100 years. Returning to his rented room in a small Smolensk hotel, Dmitry's first action was to photograph every page of the diary. The paper was fragile, some pages were stuck together, and the ink was smudged in places, but most of the text remained legible. He spent the whole night engrossed in reading, and with each page his horror and disbelief grew. Elizaveta Sokolova was the 26-year-old wife of Pyotr Sokolov, the youngest son of the family's head. In her diary, she described how their family, once one of the most respected and wealthy in the province, was trying to adapt to the new realities after the revolution. The Bolsheviks confiscated most of their property but allowed them to remain on the estate, as Pyotr, who had a medical education, agreed to treat wounded Red Army soldiers in a hospital organized in the eastern wing of the estate. The first entries were full of anxiety and uncertainty about the future but contained nothing unusual. However, starting in February, the tone of the entries began to change. Elizaveta wrote about the strange behavior of her father-in-law, Vladimir Sokolov, who began to spend long hours in the basement of the estate, forbidding anyone to go down there. She wrote about strange sounds coming from there at night, about an unpleasant smell that began to spread throughout the house, and about mysterious visitors who came to Vladimir under cover of darkness. Pyotr says that his father is simply trying to save the remnants of the family fortune, perhaps hiding valuables from the Bolsheviks. Elizaveta wrote on February 8th, "But I saw the expression in his eyes when he comes up from the basement. These are not the eyes of a person engaged in mundane affairs. Something dark, almost maniacal, shines in them. Yesterday I noticed strange spots on his hands, like dried blood. When I asked about it, he laughed and said that he had been cutting meat for the dogs. But we haven't had meat for several weeks, and our dogs were killed by the Red Army soldiers back in December." In March, the entries became increasingly alarming. Elizaveta wrote about how she noticed that the number of patients in the hospital was decreasing, but no new wounded were arriving. When she asked Pyotr about this, he replied that many had been transferred to the city hospital. But one night she heard the orderlies lowering something heavy into the basement. "Today I found a small bottle with a transparent liquid without a label in Pyotr's coat pocket," she wrote on March 20th. "When I asked him about it, he turned pale and snatched the bottle from my hands. He said it was a strong sleeping pill for particularly restless patients. But why is he keeping it in his pocket and not in the medical cabinet? And why are there no markings on the bottle?" At the end of March, an event occurred after which the tone of the diary changed completely. Elizaveta described how, taking advantage of the absence of her husband and father-in-law, she decided to go down to the basement. What she found there made her doubt her sanity. "Lord, help me understand what I saw," she wrote in a trembling hand. "The basement has been turned into some kind of laboratory. Everywhere there are strange instruments, flasks with liquids, jars with something that I cannot and do not want to describe. In the far corner is a large table with straps, all covered in dried blood. And on the walls hang strange diagrams of the human body with notes made in Vladimir's hand. I recognized his handwriting. Some parts of the body are circled in red, with some calculations and formulas. And then there are these sounds. I'm almost certain that I heard a faint moan from behind a locked door in the farthest room of the basement. I didn't dare open it. After that, the entries became shorter and more cautious, as if Elizaveta feared that someone might read her diary. She wrote about her suspicions that Vladimir, with the help of Pyotr, was conducting some terrible experiments on wounded Red Army soldiers, perhaps taking revenge for the revolution and the loss of their fortune. But doubt crept into her entries. She could not believe that her husband, who had always seemed to her to be a kind and caring man, could participate in such atrocities. On April 7th, she made an entry that made Dmitri's blood run cold. "Today I saw that creature. I can't call it a human. It climbed out of the basement when everyone was asleep. I couldn't fall asleep and was standing by the window looking at the garden. It moved awkwardly, as if not fully controlling its body. In the moonlight, I saw the seams covering its skin, as if it had been stitched together from parts of different bodies. Lord, what have they done? What have they created? The creature went into the forest, but I fear that it will return. I fear that they are creating an army of such creatures." This was the last thing Dmitri read that night, before fatigue took its toll and he fell into a restless sleep full of nightmares about deformed creatures emerging from the ground. The next morning, after drinking strong coffee, the historian continued to study the diary. Elizaveta's entries became increasingly panicked. She wrote about how she tried to talk to Pyotr, begging him to stop participating in his father's insane experiments, but he replied that they had gone too far, that these were not just experiments, but a great discovery that would change the understanding of life and death. On April 15th, she described a conversation she accidentally overheard between Pyotr and Vladimir. They were talking about some main subject. Vladimir was dissatisfied that the process was going slower than he had anticipated. Pyotr assured him that more time was needed, that it was impossible to force different parts to work in sync without a period of adaptation. Then Vladimir said something that made my blood run cold. "We cannot wait. The Reds suspect something. We need to finish the work with Mikhail and move the laboratory. Mikhail is Pyotr's younger brother, who, as we were told, was killed in battle in February. Surely they are experimenting on his body? Or, God have mercy, is he still alive and they are doing something unimaginable to him? The following entries described how Elizaveta tried to find a way to contact the authorities, but she feared that she would be intercepted. She also discovered that she was being followed. Servants reported her every move to Vladimir, and Pyotr insisted that she take fortifying drops every evening. She began to suspect that they were trying to poison her or drug her and began pretending to take the medicine, but in reality, she poured it out. On April 20th, Elizaveta made her last full entry. Today I saw Mikhail, what was left of him. I went down to the basement, taking advantage of the fact that Vladimir was in town and Pyotr had been called to a dying patient in the village. I found the key to that far room inside. God give me strength to describe it. There was a large glass container filled with some kind of liquid. Mikhail's head was floating in it, connected to strange tubes and wires. His eyes were open and moving. He was alive. Next to it, on the table, lay a body, stitched together from different parts, with an empty space for the head. They are planning to transplant his head onto this monster assembled from parts of other people. On the walls are records of experiments, a description of how they maintained life in the separated head, how they prepared the recipient body. I heard footsteps upstairs. Someone has returned. I must hide the diary and run from here. If I manage to get to the city, I will go straight to the commissar. If you are reading this, know that the Sokolov family has created a monster, and I fear that he is not the only one. After this entry, there were several blank pages. Then, in a different handwriting, more angular and uneven, a final entry, dated May 10th, was made. Elizaveta is dead. Father is dead. Pyotr is dead. I am alive, although it is difficult to call it life. The experiment was successful, but the price was too high. I feel the parts of my new body fighting each other, rejecting each other. The pain is unbearable. Pyotr promised that it would get easier over time, but he was wrong. It only gets worse. I am hiding this diary as proof of what happened here. The Reds think that the Sokolov family has fled or been killed. They do not know that I am still here, hiding in the forests around the estate. I cannot show myself to people. They will consider me a monster. Maybe they will be right. I don't know how much longer I will live in this state, but I have vowed to destroy all traces of my father's work. No one should repeat what he did. No one should go through what I, Mikhail Sokolov, or what is left of him, went through. Dmitri put down the diary, feeling cold sweat trickling down his back. If everything described was true, then he had discovered evidence of one of the earliest experiments on head transplantation, carried out in primitive conditions on living people. This would be a sensational discovery, if not for the horror of the content. The historian decided to check if there was any confirmation of this story in the official archives. He contacted the regional archive of Smolensk, where he spent several days studying documents from that period. What he discovered only increased his anxiety. The police reports for April-May 1919 did indeed mention the disappearance of the Sokolov family. According to the documents, on April 22nd, a detachment of the Red Army arrived at the estate after receiving an anonymous report of counter-revolutionary activity. They found the estate empty but with signs of a hasty escape. Medical instruments and traces of surgical operations were found in the basement, which did not cause particular suspicion, given that it housed a hospital. However, the report contained a strange detail which the official investigation ignored. One of the Red Army soldiers reported that he had seen a strange figure in the forest near the estate, moving unnaturally, as if not fully controlling his body. When he tried to approach, the creature disappeared into the thicket with incredible speed for a human. Another document, a report by a local doctor called in to inspect the basement, mentioned the discovery of biological samples stored in formalin, some of which were of clear human origin. The doctor recommended a more thorough investigation, but apparently his recommendation was ignored. This topic was not raised in subsequent documents. Dmitri found another interesting piece of evidence, an entry in the local police incident log from June 1919. Peasants from a village located 5 kilometers from the estate reported the loss of livestock in strange tracks, as if left by a person, but too deep and wide. One of the peasants claimed that he had seen a man with a stitched face in the forest but was ridiculed as a drunk and a fantasist. The most disturbing document was a report from the head of the local police, dated August 1919. It reported a series of strange deaths in the surrounding villages. The bodies of the victims were found with surgically precise cuts and the absence of some organs. The investigation yielded no results, and the deaths were officially attributed to the actions of a gang of deserters, although no evidence of their involvement was presented. After several days of research in the archives, Dmitry decided to return to the Sokolov estate. Something told him that there he could find some more evidence confirming or refuting the story described in the diary. He arrived at the site early in the morning. The April sun had already risen above the horizon, but the dense forest surrounding the estate was still swirling with morning mist, creating a ghostly, almost otherworldly atmosphere. Dmitry decided to explore the basement, which, apparently, was the center of the terrible events of 100 years ago. The entrance to the basement was blocked by debris, and it took the historian almost 2 hours to clear enough space to get inside. Descending the dilapidated steps, Dmitry turned on a powerful flashlight. The beam of light snatched from the darkness a spacious room with stone walls covered with mold and moss. Most of what was here had long since disappeared, but in some places one could still make out rusty metal fasteners on the walls, where shelves or equipment may once have been attached. In the far corner of the basement, Dmitry discovered a massive metal door, half hidden by collapsed masonry. With difficulty, he pushed the stones aside and tried to open the door, but it would not budge. Illuminating the door with a flashlight, the historian noticed that the keyhole was clogged with earth and rust. Using his Swiss Army knife, he carefully cleaned it and after several attempts managed to break the old lock. The door opened with a piercing creak, which echoed through the empty basement. Behind it was a small room which apparently once served as a laboratory. In the center stood a massive stone table, on the surface of which dark spots could still be distinguished, possibly traces of blood. Along the walls were dilapidated cabinets, some with surviving glass doors, behind which were the remains of flasks and test tubes. But the most amazing thing was found in the corner of the room. There was a large glass tank, partially broken, but still retaining its shape. At the bottom of the tank lay a thick layer of crystallized substance, probably the remains of the liquid in which, according to the diary, the head of Mikhail Sokolov floated. Next to the tank, Dmitry noticed a metal cabinet, miraculously preserved, almost untouched by time. The cabinet was locked, but the lock easily broke when the historian tried to open it. Inside lay folders with documents, most of which had turned to dust, but some, protected from moisture by the metal body of the cabinet, were preserved well enough to be read. These were records of Vladimir Sokolov's experiments, technical details of the procedures, descriptions of the results, graphs, and diagrams. From them, Dmitry learned that Vladimir, a respected surgeon before the revolution, had long been interested in the idea of organ transplantation. He conducted experiments on animals before the revolution, but with the loss of wealth and position, his moral restrictions apparently disappeared. He began to use the bodies of dead Red Army soldiers for his research, and then moved on to voluntary compulsory experiments on the wounded in the hospital. His ultimate goal was to create a method of head transplantation that would allow the life of the human brain to be extended in a new body. Judging by the records, he achieved some success in maintaining the vitality of an isolated head, connected to an artificial circulatory system, but encountered problems when trying to connect the nerve endings of the neck to a new body. The last entries, dated April 1919, described a revolutionary breakthrough. Vladimir discovered a way to stimulate the regeneration of nerve fibers with a specially developed chemical composition. He planned to test it on his youngest son, Mikhail, whose head had been kept alive in the tank for some time. For the body, the best available components were prepared: the strong arms of one Red Army soldier, the hardy legs of another, a healthy heart and lungs of a third. In the very last entry of April 21st, Vladimir wrote, "Tonight, Pyotr and I will perform the final operation. Elizaveta is starting to suspect something, but it doesn't matter. If the experiment succeeds, we will leave Russia and start a new life in Europe, where I can present my discovery to the scientific community. If not, then, well, then nothing will matter anymore. Dmitri sat on the floor of the laboratory, illuminated only by the beam of a flashlight, and tried to make sense of what he had learned. The story described in Elizaveta's diary received documentary confirmation. Vladimir Sokolov did indeed conduct monstrous experiments, trying to transplant his son's head onto a body assembled from parts of different people. And judging by the last entry in the diary, made supposedly by Mikhail himself, the experiment in some sense succeeded. What happened then? Did Mikhail survive in his new body? How long did he live? And what happened to Elizaveta, Pyotr, and Vladimir? The diary said they were dead, but under what circumstances did they die? Returning to the hotel, Dmitri could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. Several times, looking back, he caught sight of some figure, which immediately disappeared around the corner or into the crowd. Perhaps it was just paranoia caused by the gruesome discoveries, but something told the historian that the danger was quite real. That night he had a nightmare. He saw a creature with the head of Mikhail Sokolov sewn onto a body assembled from different parts. The creature chased him through the endless corridors of the estate, and when it finally caught up, it whispered, "You have revealed our secret. Now you must become a part of it." Dmitri woke up in a cold sweat with a pounding heart. A shadow flashed outside the hotel window, but when he ran to the window, the street was empty. The next day, Dmitri decided to deepen his investigation. If Mikhail Sokolov survived after the experiment, there must have been some traces of his existence. The historian went to the regional library, which housed archives of local newspapers for the past 100 years. In the newspapers for the summer of 1919, he found several notes about strange incidents in the area of the former Sokolov estate. One of them, dated June, reported an attack by an unknown beast on a flock of sheep in the village of Osipovka. Another, from July, told of the disappearance of 2 hunters who had gone into the forest near the estate. Their bodies were never found. The most interesting turned out to be a small note from August, entitled "A Gruesome Find in the Forest." It read, "A group of mushroom pickers discovered a strange burial in the forest 5 versts from the former Sokolov estate. 3 bodies were neatly laid in a row and sprinkled with earth and leaves. According to a preliminary examination, they were a middle-aged man, an elderly man, and a young woman. All 3 died from stab wounds to the heart. The identities of the victims are being established, but it is assumed that they may be members of the Sokolov family who disappeared several months ago." In later issues of the newspaper, Dmitri did not find any information about the results of the investigation, which was strange for such a high-profile case. However, in the November issue, he found a short note stating that a primitive hut had been found in the forest near Smolensk, supposedly used by a deserter or a fugitive criminal. Traces of surgical activity were found in the hut, including medical instruments and bandages with traces of blood. The hut was burned down by order of the local authorities. Dmitri understood that these disparate facts added up to a frightening picture. Apparently, Mikhail Sokolov, in his new body, killed his father, brother, and sister-in-law, buried their bodies in the forest, and then hid for some time in a makeshift hut, where he may have tried to maintain his condition with primitive medical procedures. But what happened to him then? Did he die from complications associated with tissue rejection, as he assumed in his last diary entry? Or did he manage to adapt and survive? These questions haunted Dmitri. He decided to turn to the last possible source of information, the locals. Perhaps in the villages located around the former estate, some legends or traditions related to the Sokolov family and the events of that time had been preserved. The closest village to the estate was Lipovka, located 3 kilometers away. Dmitri rented a car and went there, hoping to talk to some of the old-timers. The village turned out to be small, only about 30 houses, many of which looked abandoned. There were almost no people on the only street. Only a few elderly women sat on a bench near a rickety store. Dmitri approached them, introduced himself as a historian studying the past of these places, and asked, "Does anyone know any stories about the Sokolov family, which once owned an estate nearby?" The women exchanged glances, and one of them, the oldest, shook her head. "It's not worth stirring up the past, son. Some stories are better left buried." But Dmitri insisted, and another woman, who introduced herself as Anna Petrovna, reluctantly agreed to talk to him. She invited him into her house, a small but well-kept hut on the edge of the village. Seating the guest at the table and placing a cup of tea in front of him, Anna Petrovna began her story. "My grandmother was a young girl when all this happened," she said. "She worked on the Sokolov estate as a maid shortly before the revolution and knew the whole family. She said that the elder Sokolov, Vladimir, was a strange man, very smart, but with some kind of darkness inside. Everyone feared his cold gaze. After the revolution, when the Bolsheviks confiscated most of the Sokolov's property but allowed them to remain on the estate, Vladimir changed, became even more withdrawn, spent all his time in his office or in the basement, where no one was allowed to go down." Anna Petrovna took a sip of tea and continued. "Grandmother said that strange things began to happen in the spring of 1919. The wounded Red Army soldiers who were being treated on the estate began to disappear. Officially, they said that they had been transferred to other hospitals, but no one saw them being taken away. And then grandmother noticed how at night Vladimir and his eldest son Pyotr carried something heavy wrapped in a sheet into the basement, something that moved and moaned. In April, the grandmother, like other servants, the Sokolovs, dismissed her under the pretext of lacking funds to pay. But she suspected the real reason was different. They didn't want any witnesses to what was happening on the estate. A few weeks later, Red Army soldiers arrived, but the Sokolov family had already disappeared. It was rumored they had fled abroad, but the locals knew the truth was quite different. Anna Petrovna lowered her voice to almost a whisper. In the summer of that same year, strangely mutilated bodies of animals, and sometimes people, began to be found in the forests. Hunters and mushroom pickers said they saw a strange creature in the thicket. Tall, awkward, moving erratically, with a face that looked as though it had been stitched together from several pieces. Some claimed they recognized features of the younger Sokolov son, Mikhail, who was thought to have died at the front, in this creature. My grandmother swore that one night, the creature came to her house. She woke up to the creaking of floorboards and saw it standing in the doorway of her bedroom. It looked at her with eyes full of pain and rage, but it didn't harm her. It just stood there and stared, and then it left. Grandmother said that, despite the distorted features, she recognized Mikhail Sokolov, with whom she had once danced at village festivals. Then the creature disappeared, and for several years nothing was heard of it. Everyone assumed it had died in the forest. But in 1925, when construction of a new railway began in these parts, workers started disappearing. They were found in the forest with precise cuts on their bodies. Some parts had been carefully removed. The locals immediately remembered the stories about the Sokolov monster. A manhunt was organized, and in the depths of the forest they discovered a cave that, judging by appearances, someone was living in. Inside, they found surgical instruments, jars of formalin in which human organs floated, and records written in uneven handwriting. The creature was tracked down and cornered in a swamp, where, it is said, it drowned, but the body was never found. Since then, every few decades, strange disappearances of people occur in these places. Their bodies are found with surgically precise cuts and missing organs. The last such case was in the 90s, when a group of tourists disappeared. 2 were found dead with their hearts and livers removed, and the rest were never found. Anna Petrovna fell silent and looked out the window, where the evening twilight was thickening. Of course, officially it is believed that these were the crimes of a maniac or a gang of black market organ traffickers. But we locals know the truth. The creature still lives in these forests, and it continues the experiments of its creator. It cannot die because it is already dead. It cannot live because it consists of parts of different people that are constantly being rejected. It is forced to constantly renew its body, replacing the decaying parts with new, fresh ones. Dmitri listened to the old woman's story, feeling goosebumps run down his spine. The story she told sounded like a village legend born of fear and superstition, but it coincided too well with what he had learned from Elizaveta's diary and archival documents. "Have you seen this creature yourself?" he asked. Anna Petrovna was silent for a long time, staring into her cup. Then she slowly raised her eyes and said quietly, "5 years ago, my grandson went into the forest for mushrooms and didn't come back. We searched for him for 3 days. On the 4th, I went into the forest alone because I couldn't wait any longer. I went deeper than ever before, and in the twilight I came to a small clearing. There it stood, tall, unnaturally built, as if assembled from different parts. In its hands was the small body of my grandson. The creature looked at me with eyes full of endless weariness and pain, and I recognized in them the eyes of Mikhail Sokolov from the photograph that once hung in the manor. Could have killed me, but for some reason it didn't. It just disappeared into the forest, carrying the body of my grandson. We never found him, and I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Who would believe an old woman?" Dmitri returned to the hotel late in the evening. His mind was filled with conflicting thoughts. Anna Petrovna's story could simply be a figment of her imagination, born of grief over the loss of her grandson and village superstitions. But what if it was true? What if Vladimir Sokolov's experiment had actually succeeded, and Mikhail, in his new body, was still hiding in the forests, continuing his father's experiments to maintain his existence? This thought was too incredible to take seriously. But still, Dmitri decided to visit the estate again the next day and more thoroughly inspect the basement and the surrounding area. Perhaps there were some clues he had missed the first time. In the morning, leaving the hotel, he immediately felt that he was being watched. Turning around, he saw a tall man in a dark cloak standing on the opposite side of the street. When their eyes met, the man quickly turned away and strode off. Dmitri tried to catch up with him, but the stranger disappeared into an alley. Alarmed, but unwilling to abandon his plans, Dmitri got into his rental car and drove to the Sokolov estate. The day was overcast. Low clouds seemed ready to burst with rain. As the historian approached the abandoned estate, the first drops began to fall on the windshield. The estate looked even gloomier than on his first visit. The rain-soaked ruins of the main house, the dilapidated outbuildings, the overgrown garden, all created an atmosphere of desolation and oblivion. Dmitri put on a raincoat, took a flashlight, and headed for the entrance to the basement, which he had cleared the last time. Descending the damp steps, he smelled a strange odor, a mixture of dampness, mold, and something else he couldn't identify. The beam of the flashlight picked out the familiar outlines of the basement room. But something was wrong. Dmitri didn't immediately realize what it was, but then it dawned on him. Someone had been here after him. The metal cabinet in which he had found Vladimir Sokolov's records was open, and some folders were lying on the floor, as if someone had been hastily rummaging through them. Dmitri's heart began to beat faster. He cautiously walked to the far room, where the laboratory was located. The door, which he had struggled to open last time, was now wide open. Inside, chaos reigned. The glass tank was completely shattered, and its shards were scattered across the floor. The stone table had been moved, revealing a hatch in the floor underneath, the existence of which Dmitri had not even suspected. The hatch was open, and a cold draft and the same strange mixture of odors that the historian had smelled upon entering the basement emanated from the dark passage. With a sinking heart, Dmitri directed the beam of the flashlight into the hatch opening. There was a narrow staircase leading even deeper underground. Common sense suggested that he should not go down there alone, that he should return to the city, perhaps report his find to the police, or at least find someone who could accompany him. But curiosity and the thrill of the researcher outweighed caution. Dmitri began to descend the stairs, holding the flashlight in front of him. The staircase led into a narrow tunnel which, judging by appearances, had been dug by hand. The walls were reinforced with wooden beams, many of which had rotted from time and moisture. Dmitri moved slowly, trying not to disturb the unreliable structures. After several dozen meters, the tunnel widened, turning into a small cave with several branches. In the center of the cave stood an old wooden table on which lay rusty surgical instruments and several tattered notebooks. Dmitri approached and opened the top notebook. It was filled with the same angular, uneven handwriting as the last entry in Elizaveta's diary, the handwriting of Mikhail Sokolov. July 26, 1921. Dmitri read, "The pain is becoming unbearable. My right arm has almost completely failed. My skin is covered with ulcers. Yesterday, I caught a hunter and amputated his arm. The transplantation procedure was successful, but I don't know how long the new limb will function without rejection. Father's formula is working worse and worse each time. Turning several pages, Dmitri continued reading. September 3rd, 1923. I have improved the formula. Adding an extract of internal secretion glands from young individuals significantly slows down the rejection process. The latest heart transplant has been holding for 4 months without signs of dysfunction. But finding suitable donors is becoming increasingly difficult. People are starting to avoid these forests. And finally, the last entry, dated March 15th, 1954. I am no longer a man, but not a monster either. I am an experiment that has been going on for 35 years. My body contains parts from more than 100 different people. My mind remains clear, but my soul? Do I even have one anymore? I continue my father's work, not out of a thirst for knowledge, but out of fear of death. Each new transplant gives me a few more years of existence, but I am tired. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of the pain and loneliness. Perhaps the next experiment will be the last. But this was not the last entry in the notebooks. Dmitri discovered with horror that the records continued on through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the most recent were dated to the beginning of 2023, only a few months ago. January 8th, 2023. Rumors of my existence have begun to spread among the locals again. I will have to temporarily cease experiments and lie low. Fortunately, I have enough supplies of organs and tissues to last for several months. After things calm down, I will return to work. The latest modification of the formula is showing promising results. Transplanted tissues are integrating faster and functioning almost flawlessly. Perhaps I am finally approaching the state of stability that I have been seeking all these years. Dmitri slammed the notebook shut, feeling the blood run cold in his veins. If the records were not a hoax, then Mikhail Sokolov, or what was left of him, was still alive and possibly somewhere nearby. For more than 100 years, he had maintained his existence by replacing the dying parts of his body with new ones taken from the people he killed. Suddenly, Dmitri heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnel. Someone was approaching the cave. Turning off his flashlight, the historian hid behind an outcrop of rock and held his breath. A tall figure entered the cave, illuminating the path in front of them with a flashlight. It was the same man in the dark cloak that Dmitri had seen near the hotel in the morning. In the light of the flashlight, his face looked strangely immobile, like a mask. He walked to the table, picked up one of the notebooks, and began to leaf through it. Dmitri tried not to breathe, but his foot slipped, and a small pebble rolled across the floor. The sound was barely audible, but in the silence of the cave, it sounded like a gunshot. The man turned sharply, pointing the flashlight toward Dmitri. The beam of light picked out the historian's frightened face from the darkness. "I knew you'd be back," the man said in a voice that mixed different timbres, as if several people were speaking at the same time. "People always come back when they find part of a mystery. They can't stop until they know everything. That's what destroys them." Dmitri wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. He watched as the man slowly approached him and saw with horror that under the cloak, his body moved unnaturally, as if its parts were not fully synchronized with each other. "You found Elizaveta's diary," the man continued. "You read my father's records. Now you know who I am, or rather what I am." "Mikhail Sokolov," Dmitri breathed. "But that's impossible. You should have died decades ago." The man laughed a strange, mechanical laugh. "Death is simply a malfunction of the body that can be corrected with the right parts. My father understood this, although his methods were primitive. I have perfected them over the past century. Each year, I replace about 20% of my body. Some parts last longer, some less. The heart, for example, has to be changed every 5 to 7 years. The brain is the only thing that's left of the original Mikhail Sokolov. Yes, and even that I've partially modified, replacing damaged areas. The man took another step forward and threw back the hood of his cloak. Dmitri gasped in horror. Mikhail's face looked like a mosaic of poorly fitted pieces of skin of different shades. The seams connecting these pieces were barely noticeable, but still distinguishable upon closer inspection. The eyes were different colors, one brown, the other blue, and they did not move quite synchronously. "I have become better at my art," Mikhail said, noticing Dmitri's reaction. "The early works were rough, but now I can create almost perfect connections. Most people don't even notice anything strange unless they look very closely. I can walk among them when I need to, although I prefer the solitude of these forests and caves." You've been killing people all these years," Dmitri whispered. "I've been maintaining my existence," Mikhail replied calmly. "Like any living creature, the only difference is in the methods. But I'm not a ruthless killer, if that's any consolation to you. I choose my donors carefully. Criminals, the scum of society, those who no one will look for. And I always do it quickly and painlessly. They fall asleep and never wake up again, and their bodies serve a higher purpose, the continuation of a unique experiment that has lasted for more than a century." Mikhail walked to the table and picked up one of the surgical instruments, a long scalpel with a blade that had darkened with age. "The problem is that now you know about me, and being a historian, you won't be able to keep this knowledge to yourself. You'll want to tell the world, write an article, a book, and I can't allow that." Dmitri realized that his life was hanging by a thread. He frantically searched for a way out of the situation. "I won't tell anyone," he said. "I swear. I'll just leave and forget everything I've seen and learned." "You're not the first to make such a promise," Mikhail replied with a sad smile. "And they all broke it. But today is your lucky day. I'm not going to kill you." Dmitri looked at the monster in front of him in disbelief. "You're not? Really?" Mikhail shook his head. "At least not right away. You see, I've reached the limit of what I can do on my own. My hands aren't as nimble as they used to be, and my eyesight is getting worse every year. I need an assistant, someone with medical knowledge, a sharp mind, and a certain flexibility of moral principles. I'm a historian, not a doctor," Dmitri objected. "I don't know anything about surgery or organ transplantation." "But you can learn," Mikhail said. "You'll have an excellent teacher, a man who has perfected these techniques for more than 100 years. And most importantly, you have motivation." He walked to the far wall of the cave and pulled aside a rag that was hanging there, revealing a small niche. Inside, on a stone ledge, stood 3 glass containers filled with a transparent liquid. In each floated something resembling a shriveled brain with tubes and wires connected to it. "You know what these are, don't you?" Mikhail asked. "These are the brains of my father, my brother, and Elizaveta. I extracted them immediately after their deaths and placed them in a nutrient medium. They don't function fully. There is no consciousness or thoughts here, but basic functions have been preserved for more than 100 years. It's part of my experiment on the long-term preservation of brain tissue." Dmitri stared at the gruesome exhibits with a mixture of horror and scientific curiosity. "But why? Why preserve the brains of the people you killed?" "I didn't kill them," Mikhail objected. "At least not directly. When I woke up after the operation in my new body, I was furious and desperate. The pain was unbearable. The parts of my body wouldn't obey me. I found my father in his study. He was delighted with the success of the operation and didn't even notice my anger. When I grabbed him by the throat, he thought until the very last moment that I was just testing the strength of my new hands. Pyotr tried to stop me, and in the scuffle he fell so badly that he broke his neck. And Elizaveta? She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Seeing me over the bodies of my family, she screamed, and I, not controlling my new strength, pushed her away. She hit her head on a stone ledge and died instantly." Mikhail fondly stroked the glass containers with the brains. "I preserved their brains as a reminder of the price I paid for my immortality and as material for research. Of course, my father's brain tissue helped me to decipher and improve his formulas, but they also serve as a warning to those who decide to betray me." He turned to Dmitri. "I have a proposition. You will become my assistant. You will help with experiments and procedures. In exchange, I will share with you the knowledge accumulated over a century of research at the intersection of life and death. Knowledge that can give you, if not immortality, then at least a significantly extended life. And if I refuse? Dmitri asked, although he already knew the answer. Then another exhibit will be added to this collection? I will add you to this collection, Mikhail replied calmly. But honestly, I hope you agree. You are the first in many years who has found my diary and shown enough persistence to get to the truth. You have the intelligence and determination that I value. Dmitri realized that he had no choice. He could agree and stay alive, hoping for a chance to escape in the future, or refuse and die here and now. All right, he said after a long pause. I agree to become your assistant. Mikhail smiled a gruesome, asymmetrical smile. An excellent decision. We will begin your training tomorrow, and today I will show you your new dwelling. He gestured for Dmitri to follow him through one of the tunnels leading from the main cave. They walked for several minutes until they reached a small room carved into the rock. Inside was a simple bed, a table, a chair, and a bookcase filled with old medical tomes. Make yourself at home, Mikhail said. This will be your home for the foreseeable future. Don't try to escape. The tunnels form a labyrinth in which it is easy to get lost and die of hunger and thirst. Only I know all the exits. With these words, he left, leaving Dmitri alone. The historian sat down on the bed, trying to make sense of the situation he was in. He had become a prisoner and potential accomplice of a creature that had been sustaining its life by killing other people for more than 100 years. A creature that had once been a man, but now represented something on the border between life and death, between man and monster. But along with horror and despair, Dmitri also felt something else strange, frightening in its curiosity. What if Mikhail had really discovered the secret of extending life? What if his research, for all its monstrosity, could lead to revolutionary discoveries in medicine? The thought of access to the knowledge accumulated over a century of experiments was tempting. No, Dmitri whispered to himself. This is madness. I must find a way to escape and tell the world about this monster. But even as he spoke these words, he was not sure that he really wanted to escape. A part of him, a dark, hidden part, was intrigued by the prospect of becoming a student of Mikhail Sokolov, the last member of a family whose dark history had now become part of his own destiny. 2 weeks before these events, in that same forest near the abandoned Sokolov estate, a group of tourists disappeared. 3 young men and 2 girls. Search parties combed the forest for several days, but found no trace of the missing persons except for their abandoned tents and personal belongings. Local residents involved in the search tried to stay away from a certain part of the forest, where, according to them, there was an unclean place. They told the visiting rescuers old legends about the Sokolov monster, but no one took them seriously. In police reports, the disappearance of the tourists was classified as a missing persons case under unexplained circumstances. The investigation reached a dead end and gradually lost priority among other cases. No one connected this disappearance with the discovery of Elizaveta Sokolova's diary and the subsequent disappearance of historian Dmitry Pakimov. No one paid attention to the strange tall man who occasionally appeared in nearby towns, always in dark clothes hiding his body and with a face that evoked a vague sense of wrongness in observers, although they could not explain exactly what it consisted of. No one knew that deep underground, in a labyrinth of tunnels and caves, the experiment begun more than 100 years ago continued, an experiment in which not only its creator took part, but also those who had the misfortune to get too close to the secret that the forests around the old Sokolov estate concealed. And no one suspected that one day this secret might go beyond the Smolensk forests, when Mikhail decided that the time had come to present the results of his research to the world, a world that might not yet be ready to know how thin the line is between life and death, between man and monster, between science and madness. And if you ever find yourself in the forests near Smolensk and see a strange hill, like an anthill but too regular in shape, don't try to dig it up. Some secrets should remain buried, and some diaries should never be read, because knowledge sometimes comes at too high a price, and curiosity can lead to a place from which there is no return. But if you still decide to dig, Remember that somewhere in these forests walks a creature assembled from the parts of different people, a creature with a brain that remembers events from more than a century ago, and it is always looking for new spare parts for its eternal experiment.